can you give us an example, one neat example of where thinking civilizationally just completely misleads us, where we get it wrong when we think in those terms? And when you say civilization didn't exist before the 19th century, I'm tempted to reply, not much existed before the 19th century in the terms we use to talk about history. So, show us the power of your view.
Okay, so one example would be the alphabet. Right, that's an absolutely classic part of what we would think of as Western civilizations. The alphabet that's used, in many different versions, but all over the modern West. And I think there's one way of looking at it, which is to say, well, we all know this is not originally, the alphabets that it's used to write English now come originally from the Greek alphabet, but it's relatively well known, and indeed we're told by forward, Phoenicians very close to the West and so on, no problem with that. But the thing is, what I discovered writing this book is that actually those original letters, those original alphabetic letters, the first ones in the world, still the root of every single world alphabet except the Korean one, actually were invented in Egypt. And they weren't invented by Egyptians, they were invented by people from the Levant, from people we might call Phoenicians, but they were invented when they were there as guest workers, and it was the first time working in the royal turquoise mines in Sinai, about 2000 BCE. This was the first time they'd actually had a reason to write down their own language. And so they had to invent this new way of doing it that wasn't one of the incredibly complicated ancient cuneiform or hieroglyphic forms. But they wanted a simple alphabet that they could use. So they used this pictogram method, because the alphabet is basically pictograms, yeah? A, aleph, it's the head of an ox, an aleph, and so on. So B, bait, it's a house, bait. So a really simple system that you could, you didn't even have to learn it, really. You just had to know what the trick was and know what the language was. But they only did this when they were in Egypt, when they wanted to kind of leave messages for each other, also when they wanted to talk to their own gods, interestingly. But what they actually got their little pictures from was from Egyptian hieroglyphs. Every single one of the alphabetic letters goes back to Egyptian hieroglyphs. And I think that's really, that kind of complication is where civilizations cut you off.
So in a sense, what you're saying is it teaches the self-satisfied West a little bit of humility, that many of the things that it thought it had invented, sorry, sunshine, you didn't. Now,
well, there's a lot of that, but there's also, I really hope that one of the important messages of this book is that people never invent things by themselves. You always have to do it by being confronted with new situations, new ideas, new people. It's only when people get put in new and often probably quite uncomfortable situations that innovation really happens. So I think my message is that it's not civilizations but connections that make history.
And the other thing which seems to me to underline the book, and this is where I think it's got something in common with Silk Roads of Peter, is that you can sometimes see those new ways of thinking much more clearly if you take a different perspective. If you center your history somewhere else and then look at the familiar from the outside. And I think in a way that's what I got out of Silk Roads, maybe rather crudely, Peter.
I want to keep listening to you two.
No, you're not getting off quite so lightly. We want a short comment to pithily sum us up, and then we'll move on.
Well, I learned lots of things from classicists, and one is to always ask about what the roots of words are. And the first thing is the idea of civilization and its connection to cities. My worlds are about incorporating voices that don't have written scripts, oral traditions, steppe nomadic worlds, the worlds of Central Asia. There's some very, very interesting, exciting work about how this is Joe this is the first time Joe's speaking about her new book, so the fanfares that keep coming up, I think, are in celebration. 2 weeks or 3 weeks out of Joe's launch. It's about how important the worlds of Central Asia, the productions of protein, dairy, textiles, and particularly horses, have been to the creation of global empires. And about 85% of empires have risen in connection with these steppe lands. So to some extent, it's a bit like Joe, of thinking about how do we stop, or how do we begin our histories without starting in the corridors of power of ancient Rome, as Mary does as well, to remind us there are other provinces and regions that we need to be looking at, other social categorizations, other sexualities, and so on. But I think exchange is the key thing. So I mean, as a very simple world that I work on, of thinking about how do these exchanges between different groups, whether they're urban or whether they're demographically dense or not, we find, for example, about 4,000 years ago, a huge intensification of hierarchies from Indus Valley, which is much less social hierarchies than we find in Mesopotamia, Chinese civilizations or states, whatever you want to call them, Egypt, the Levant, almost certainly to do with the spread of new technologies. In this case, it's the spread of metallurgy and bronze. And when you find bronze being introduced into new cities and the tools to give the elites more power over warfare, over production of deities and of religious images and icons and metals and things like this for all sorts of other uses, you find, a bit like we find today, the control of new technologies in Silicon Valley produces generations of super rich. So exchange is a kind of driver of lots and lots of new ideas, often spread out over large distances. And the question is, where do the people live who are adopting these and why? Are they minorities? Are they guest workers? Are they accountants? And in fact, when you look at the first writing scripts developed in Mesopotamia and in the Indus Valley, Indus one's more complicated for lots of reasons, these are adopted, first of all, by elites trying to control production, to measure what's being grown. And accountants are the reason we have these great works of literature that get written down later, because you need to be able to tabulate how much tax you're gathering. So the tools of administration, the tools of institutions, the ways in which ideas get copied and borrowed and how they get spread over long distances is something I'm very interested in. That's why it resonates with both of your work.
Yeah.
I can just pick up on that story of these sort of accountant scripts. I mean, that's another example of the power of exchange once it gets to the Mediterranean. Because one thing that happens when the very first sailing ships arrive in the Mediterranean, when people first work out how to sail west, essentially, against the winds in the Mediterranean, that happens about 2000 BCE. And the first place, as far as we can tell, that sailing ships get to from Egypt and the Levant, that's where they're coming from, the first place they get to is Crete. And suddenly, on Crete, people start to write things down. But again, they don't use Egyptian language or letters. They don't use the alphabets that already could be found at that point in the Levant, where these ships are actually setting out from. They invent their own system, completely their own version, to such an extent that we still can't read Linear A today. It's still completely mysterious. But it happens exactly the moment these boats start to arrive. So clearly what's going on there is that the idea of writing, maybe even the sailors who arrive can't write themselves, but they tell people about it, they communicate, they tell people about this new technology, and it gives these accountants and these elites an idea, aha, that's how we're going to make our fields more profitable, our palaces more profitable, and so on.
I think that this, I suppose I'd want to add an extra element to the way I summed up the book, which was in a sense partly changing our perspective. I mean, I think that the other thing that you do is you, as it were, cease to talk about civilization as if it was a thing, right? You talk about it as if it's a process, a set of movements, a set of interactions. And it reminded me very much when I was reading it that of what the philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah famously said about, the traditional Western view of civilization, which is that it is a golden nugget. And that golden nugget, starts off in Greece, is passed to Rome, tours Europe, and then ends up in Harvard, basically. Like many things, it's like the kind of reification of it, which is brilliantly summed up in the golden nugget. It is something which I think you're trying to as it were, pull the plug on a bit. It's not that the people that Appiah's talking about thought that Western civilization was the only civilization. They certainly didn't do that. But insofar as they thought of the West and its culture, they thought of it as a kind of a parcel that got passed around.
Absolutely. And this is what I think is actually really new in the 19th century, and really is, in a way, why this book matters. So civilization, in the singular, actually goes back to the 18th century, first used in about the 1750s. And when people first start to think in terms of civilization, in France, of course, it's a single thing and anyone can do it. The French are particularly good at it. But in theory, anyone could become civilized if they just tried hard enough, or if they were helped to try hard enough. And so there's this stage of European imperialism in the 18th century going into the 19th century where there's a lot of justification going on around this idea, this singular idea of civilization. This is really, we're bringing benefits, we're helping people into this universal civilization that we just happen to have discovered in Europe. But then in the 19th century, this new idea that there are plural civilizations, that there are parcels, if you like, of civilizations. Well, that's even more useful for the European imperialists, because then you can say, well, unfortunately, some of these parcels just don't have as much potential for progress as others. They're all important, they're all special, they're all interesting, but unfortunately, some of them are just never going to get to the stage of Europe or often of France and so on. And this is, of course, happening exactly the same time as the idea of separate races are coming into sort of scientific focus as well. And at the same time as the nation is becoming a really important concept in European thought. So I think all these things are coming out together, and that's really the bundle of things that I call civilizational thinking. And that's really the kind of danger of civilizations to me.
Can I bring us back a minute to where we are in Jaipur? Because I think, picking up from what you said, in the traditional histories of the West, there's a recognition of India as representing a different civilization. However, some people valued it very highly, some people didn't, but there was a kind of division between the civilization of the West and what people saw, both from inside and outside, in India. Now, I think one of the things that has changed a lot, and both your books have done huge amounts to help this change, but there are other people active, is to say, look, how does history look different if we don't have that firm boundary between India and, let's say, ancient Rome? And here you have some really wonderfully evocative pages about how, in some ways, it's impossible to understand on any terms what ancient Rome's about if you don't cast your eye eastwards.
Right. India is, I think one of the ways that kind of brings out how important India is in ancient ways of thinking, as opposed to modern ways of thinking about kind of Western civilization, is that the Romans really have no idea where China is or what it is. They know there is something called China and that silk comes from it. It might be a city, it might be a region. People are very vague. They sort of put it on maps in a kind of pin the tail on the donkey way. But if you compare that to what Romans know about India, the difference is absolute. I mean, incredibly detailed information about every coast, every port, all the different imports and exports and so on. There's a huge amount of information available about India in the classical Mediterranean. I think, much more than people in the Mediterranean probably know now. But one of the things that's fascinating to me is that there's a particular book or kind of text called The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, the sailing around of the Indian Ocean, basically, which describes the extraordinary connections that are being made between India, East Africa, and Egypt in the Roman period that are being controlled, on the Egyptian end at least, by the Roman state and taxed to a huge degree by the Roman state. This is one of the really big funders of the Roman army, of Roman Empire in the 1st, 2nd century CE, is just the tax on trading in the Indian Ocean. But this extraordinary text, which is just full of detail on all these places, even on the different kinds of sea snakes that will come out to meet you from these different ports, it only mentions Rome once. The people who were involved in this world that is funding the Roman Empire think of it as, at most, if they think of that end of it at all, they call it Greek. But there's a one mention of Julius Caesar, which might even be a later interpolation. It's the only time that, from the perspective of people who are actually running this huge system around the Western Indian Ocean, that's the only time that actually Rome even comes on their horizon.
Peter, this is getting into your territory.
Well, a lot depends on whether these texts are accurate and whether they're geographies or whether they're works of fiction. I mean, there's nothing in these texts about the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf or the Gulf at all. And so the exclusions, the things that are left out, are just as interesting. And, one of the big challenges we have, I think, when we look at so-called Indian Ocean worlds or monsoon worlds, there's a lot of discussion about how valid these are as terms of descriptions anyway and how useful, is that we can see very easily what it is that's being imported into the Red Sea region and into the Mediterranean. It's much harder to see what goes in the other direction because, as Gandhi said, the idea of Western civilization, it's a nice idea or good aspiration. So to see what comes, we can see coins, but those are essentially useless. I mean, the fact we find coins are because they can't be spent on things rather than because they can. So it's quite easy, I think, to get tempted by individual one-off texts. So we can see almost all trade in all periods, all regions, whether it's land, sea, etc., is local. Long-distance trade doesn't really exist insofar as goods loaded at point A crossing thousands of miles because the profit margins aren't there and the risks are very high. So things get telegraphed along. So I guess the starting point would be to think about geographies and ports along the southern coast of what's now Pakistan and into the Gulf, which is a much cleaner, easier route in. So it's where's the evidence and what do we look at for the ways in which ocean trade is connected into the Persian world and beyond. And so I think, one of the challenges when we're deconstructing the West, which I absolutely buy into, is not to then also take on the idea of India. We should think of many, 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 many Indias and many different languages, beliefs, geographies, ecologies, and to be quite careful not learn from those lessons of having one kind of big chapter and catch-all that says this is who the West is. Because, when we even think about Western civilization and slave trades and the way the West rose, it's quite hard to throw the Czechs and the Poles and the Bulgarians under the bus of transatlantic slavery and the rise of the West and the exploitation of empires and of other peoples. French, Belgians, Spanish, Portuguese, British, fair enough, right? But we're not all in it equally together. So I think when it comes to the Indian world or the subcontinent world, modern India and its shape and its borders and boundaries, what things look like 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago. So the text that Joe's talking about is hugely informative for around about 2,000 years ago. Scroll it forward 300 years beyond that, 500 years beyond that, and things look very, very, very different, where you find no references to trade. And it can't be that people are not interested in the same goods anymore. So trying to be careful about how we construct all of this it's really difficult, right? Because it's very easy to kind of overcook it. And the big problem, I think, when one looks at the Indian subcontinent is the ways in which river systems work. They're very filled with silt, so port estuaries are constantly destroyed and dry up. And it means that the great Indian cities of antiquity are sometimes quite near the coast, but they're not on the coast. They're not Rome, they're not the Tiber, they're not the Nile, they're not Alexandria, they're not the great cities of the Levant. They tend to be inland. The great Indian rulers have all of their capitals, their multiple capitals, are in hinterland areas which produce agriculture, and they're very uninterested in long-distance trade when we read the Indian texts. Sanskrit texts and onwards, there's not much interest in worlds beyond, because this is where things matter. So it's really exciting, I think, to do what you're doing, Joe, and to be saying, look, there are these important ways of connections we should look at that all of us as classicists and historians in the West have spent 500 years not really thinking about. I mean, huge kudos to you to challenge us to think in the way that Mary's done in all of her work too, that quite simple questions we just haven't really thought about very hard.
I think that's right. And I'm actually going to push back on the idea of text. I'm a classicist at heart, and I'm going to stand up.
Not at heart, you're a professor of classics at Oxford, yeah.
There is that
Not
too.
at heart, yeah.
But I'm going to stand up for the text here, because one of the most interesting things about these texts that come out of this particular moment, kind of early imperial, this is very much the period of Mary's new book, the kind of early imperial period in Rome, is that they do miss out the Persian Gulf, and that is weird. The Persian Gulf is where has been the real kind of heart of trade around the Western Indian Ocean for at least 2,000 years before that. And I think it's actually a clue to why we can rely on these texts, in fact, because there is this couple of 100 years where people stop going to the Gulf. And I think the reason is there's a lot of disruption along the Euphrates in that period. It's at a moment when kind of they've got the Roman Empire on one side, the Parthians on the other side, no one's really controlling the borderlands, and it becomes a really tricky trade route, essentially. And it's not until the growth of Palmyra and the kind of shortcut through the desert in about, let's say, by about 100 CE, people are then taking the Palmyra route to the Euphrates and then the Tigris, and then the Persian Gulf comes back. But to me, it's the very fact that it's missing there. It's actually key to, maybe this is actually true.
But what I got out of the book was, and I expect you won't like this, is, look, it doesn't actually matter hugely whether it's true or not, because what you're showing us, what you're opening up, is a world of, let's say, because we're talking about it, Greco-Roman, Roman culture, in which, from the realm of myth and fantasy down to real-life trading relationships, the people that we've been studying for hundreds and hundreds of years constantly have the outside, in some senses, on their horizon. The thought world of the Romans isn't as narrowly kind of classical, I'm putting that in inverted commas, as it has suited us to pretend that it was. And you can argue till the cows come home about whether this text is accurate or not, but that's only, I think, a secondary question. And where I think people will find your book quite surprising in a way, enlightening, is that when you are looking for hard data, you are turning to the fruits of scientific analysis of human remains or traces of climate change, etc., that really would not have been possible to do if you'd been writing the book 30 years ago. And I think it's, we all, as people inside the subject, we sort of know that and take account of and are interested in ideas about tracking migration through skeletal remains, but it still often remains a bit kind of a side interest. And what I think is really interesting in your book is that that hard data about where that person whose remains that we have grew up is actually integrated into the historical narrative. And you might give us a favourite example of that.
Okay, so this is something that I absolutely could not have done even 5 years ago, I think, because ancient DNA itself is a relatively new science. It was only, say, 20 years ago, everyone was talking about mitochondrial DNA and Y DNA, basically tracing back from modern populations to what must have happened in the past. And it's really only, in the last 15, 20 years that it's become kind of financially possible to actually extract and process genuine ancient DNA from ancient human remains to recreate now often whole genomes, and really find out a lot about people's heritage in one way or another, and many other things about them. And the thing is that the way this has happened, it's kind of creeping onto the historical horizon. So first of all, there was a lot of stuff about the Yamnaya and so on, and peoples, the steppe peoples and so on from the 4th, 3rd millennium and their movements. And then it came into the Bronze Age, and you began to see people moving around. And now it's really hitting the Iron Age, which is to say, the classical period. And I think this is huge for ancient historians and actually quite dangerous for us. I think a lot of people really are interested in this stuff, and unless people like me are doing our best to stay on top of it, to interpret it in the light of the archaeological information, the historical information, we're just going to hand it over to crazy people on the internet, essentially, who think they understand the scientific papers that they're reading and can immediately kind of make maps of migrations and so on, invasions they're often called. So I think this is really something that people like me have to try and take responsibility for now. And so recent examples, this is just something that was published last year. I'm particularly interested in the Phoenicians. They're one of my favorite Mediterranean peoples. And of course, one of the things that the Phoenicians are famous for is colonizing the Western Mediterranean, even before the Greeks did, and so on. There was Carthage, Cadiz in Spain, these incredibly old Phoenician colonies. Anyway, we're finally actually getting ancient DNA evidence from Western Mediterranean sites of this period. So we're talking like 1,000 to 500 BCE now. And the amount of movement around the Western Mediterranean is extraordinary. You get Africans in Sardinia, Italians in Spain. Everyone is shifting, moving around, and being buried somewhere else, crucially. Not just traveling somewhere, visiting, and so on, but actually staying somewhere long enough to die there.
Dying, I think, is crucial, actually.
But there is almost no evidence from the Levant in ancient DNA in the latest, the very latest publications. And that is just fascinating to me. The whole idea that an awful lot of people were coming west. I mean, we're going to have to wait for a lot more data to actually come to any even kind of interim conclusions on this. But there's a real possibility opening up that actually there were very few Phoenicians in the West, and that still this migration of a few people at a certain point was part of setting off a series of events that led to this extraordinary patterns of circulation there.
You could think about it like JLF. I mean, I had home on Monday morning, and I'm not going to leave any DNA imprint here with a new generation, luckily because my wife is with me. And if you know, we might have one back in the United Kingdom, you never know.
Careful.
I shouldn't have said that. But when people travel, like we're all doing here, from wherever you come from, whether you're from Jaipur or from different parts of India or elsewhere for this wonderful festival, you spread ideas. And so the spread of ideas, the spread of goods, the spread of material culture is very different to the genetic material. As Joe says, that it's not just crazy people on the internet. Those discussions, particularly here in India, about where populations come from and who is more Indian and what does Indian mean and where the connections with Yamnai or Aryan peoples, you know, where 20% of the male population in northern India are the same haplotype as men in Scandinavia. You know, explain that within a context of that's politically highly sensitive. You know, you quickly go into the kinds of things that all of us have been involved, particularly Mary, very bravely, about what does migration mean? What does identity mean? What does it mean to be Roman or Indian? And in fact, some of these trading networks we're thinking about, you know, those lack of signatures of, for example, Indian traders in the Mediterranean is very, very small because, and you know, sailors, like traders, they do stay for quite a long time. They do have sex. They do have children. So we need to think quite hard about where are those signatures? What is being spread? Are we being fooled by randomness? And we've got to start with leading with the data. And that's a whole new set of challenges for us all.
We could go on like this, huge interest for hours. But I would like to give time for at least 5 minutes, if we've got roving mics, to have some questions from the audience. Can I just finish, though, by asking you both just a very quick question. both Joe and Peter come from Oxford. They're both professors. Peter's a professor of global history. It's a very daunting title, I have to say. Joe of ancient history. What I didn't say is that they're both in the same Oxford college. So what we've had is a glimpse of what conversation must be like at lunch there, for better or worse. Better, I mean.
Better.
For better.
Better.
Right?
Much better.
I love Joe.
Do you think, history on this big scale is the thing of the future? You've been very nice to me, saying, oh, Mary does the same. Mary doesn't do the same. She does the Romans. Do you think how do you see your kind of big picture fitting with my micro picture? Does an attack on civilizational thinking still need civilizational thinking, is what I want. And I only want a sentence, please, because otherwise people won't have a chance to ask their questions.
So I think it's the same. I think my history is millions of micro histories joined up together, hopefully elegantly. So there are lots of books that are hugely generalized, and they're like impressionist paintings. From a distance, they look great, and they are great. And then when you get closer, it's a bit fuzzy around the edges. And I'm not going to name any of those. I think that proper scholarly rigor is building from the ground up. It's building from individual sources, data points, trying to handle those robustly, maybe not at great length, but trying to do it so that there is the contextual detail, so that other scholars who work as specialists in the field will recognize what you're writing and will recognize the apparatus that supports it in terms of the scholarly research. So I think it's exactly the same approach of starting ground up, small points, and then trying to build into a bigger picture.
Now, Joe, tell us your next book is going to be a micro-study of a village in Roman North Africa.
No, it's going to be a study of anarchic politics across the ancient Mediterranean. A little bit smaller this time.
Is it? Great.
But so it's sort of semi-global history. Well, quarter-global history.
Quarter-global history is about where I'm comfortable.
I always remember that someone said to me when I was much younger and going on about how exciting interdisciplinary history was, so that's what we all had to do. They turned around and said, you can't have interdisciplinary without the disciplines. And I think that was quite important. Now, we've got just over 5 minutes, and I hope we've got some roving mics, and I hope somebody will take them to people whose hands are up. I have to confess I haven't got my glasses on.
Shall I point? There's a lady in the front.
So can I hand over to Professor Frankopan to point to the people, because I'm afraid you're a bit of a blur to me.
More hands. There's hands, please, so I can point to
I can see that one. Can we get a mic here?
Micro in front row, please. Or nearly front row.
Have we got some mics?
I'm particularly keen on anybody who is young or thinks that they're young.
I'm 25, does that count?
Yeah, that's properly young.
I'm not
I think
so sure about
under
that.
60 first, please.
Perfect. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. I wanted to ask a little bit about the prescriptive that you might have for the future of global history and global historical scholarship, understanding that, of course, we need to deconstruct the West, as Peter said, India, or the East in general. Do you see a use for something like the cosmopolis or cosmopolitism or the Persianate, the Islamicate, these sort of gray, broader things, bigger than civilizations, less concrete than civilizations, that we can use? Do we need to sacrifice them, or is there still a utility for historical categories? Thank you.
So I think that, that's a great question. And I think one thing that at some point we have to stop doing is all of us writing these really huge books about everything. Thinking a bit more about...
I'll do that book on the little village in North Africa, if it's still available.
That's what I'm waiting for.
We got it sorted. But I think rather than looking for me, I think that rather than looking for an alternative to thinking in terms of civilization, something like that, what I would like to do is keep thinking about these connections in particular and looking at those processes and those roots and so on. And I will say this, I have a slight problem with one of those ideas. The idea of cosmopolitanism. It's enormously attractive, right? This idea that we are citizens of the world, essentially, and that's the way to think of things. The problem is that all the people who have called themselves cosmopolitans, historically, are extremely privileged people who were in the process of taking over other parts of the world. And so I'm just a little bit nervous of that concept, and that it might be a little bit more useful for some people than others.
It sounds as if you're reliving the British Brexit debate there. Cosmopolitanism was certainly an elite concept.
More questions. There's a gentleman here in the green top. Anybody at the back? No hands at the back? No one? No. Oh, yes, okay. Next one,
See
right in
some
the back.
hands.
Yes, this one here, please, with the green jacket. Stand up. Microphone further back, please. A bit further back. Okay.
My eyes are sharpening.
And can we get a microphone to the gentleman at the back too for next, please?
Thanks so much for such an insightful talk. I'm a trained historian and anthropologist, so this was fascinating from a source perspective. I had a question about the field of historical study in academia itself, because you've had this dominance of Western thought in academia, and you see less representation of what you could call, quote-unquote, Eastern ways of thinking. How can academia, and specifically history, evolve itself to, one, incentivize works like yours, but also to be more nuanced, have a more systems thinking approach, to value this interconnectedness without, I guess, platforming one ideology over others?
A quick solution.
Okay.
Microphone to the back.
Two quick solutions there. One is that we need to be talking more with each other and not just to our own immediate colleagues and so on. So there's a great initiative at Mary's University, forgotten its name, but...
Cambridge.
Oh yes, Cambridge, yeah. There's a great initiative there called the Global Humanities Initiative, which is working with Cambridge, universities in India, two universities in Ghana, that kind of thing, and actually bring people together for conversations on all sorts of things that are actually just introducing really new perspectives, not just new places and new data, but completely new perspectives from all directions. So I think, actually, I'll leave it there. I think that is the way forwards for us.
Just as a plug for the Global Humanities Initiative, seeing you gave me the opportunity, there's a conference in a couple of weeks in Mumbai, which is partly to discuss and to celebrate the very global exhibition of ancient representations of the divine that is currently on there, which everybody should go and see if they get a chance.
Great. Gentleman at the back with the microphone.
Hello. Oh, thank you for being here with us. Am I clear?
Yes.
Cool. So you were talking about like global history and like history at large scales. So what is the prospects of, like, I come from a mathematics background. So also I've been working with mathematical modeling. So what is the prospects of like stuff like from their mathematical modeling in like historical research? Because I've seen stuff being done. I've heard of this person called Peter Turchin and cliodynamics, the field of cliodynamics. So what is the future there? What are the things we should be looking out for there?
Well, there's tons. Peter's great. I know his work well. I know Peter. He's terrific. So both cliodynamics, spatial modeling, machine learning, artificial intelligence, they are tools that we are using as historians increasingly. And one of the challenges now is to train historians in different ways. And that becomes expensive and it becomes difficult. Most of us in the United Kingdom pick a humanities track or a science track when we're 16. And so, as both Mary and Joe say, the only way it can work is through high levels of collaboration, of treating education like it's a lifelong process. You don't stop being a student when you do your master's or your PhD. You have to keep on learning, and that can be quite challenging to always feel that you don't know enough. But I suspect, speaking of myself anyway, that's why I feel lucky that I've got the job that I have, which is that every day is to be looking at things that I don't know rather than be smug about the things that I do. So I think that the mathematics, earth sciences, plant sciences, all the new tools we have are absolutely fundamental. We are the last generation of historians that won't be trained in those formally. The next generations, it's absolutely essential.
And it depends on things as simple and down to earth as how the university or the school or the Institute of Higher Education is divided and defined and built. I mean, who you have coffee with is probably more important than almost anything else. And the disciplines, certainly in our universities, have made it almost impossible to talk to people outside your own narrow field.
You know, Joe and I, we are colleagues at the same college, but we do get to sit next to not just each other at lunch, but next to people who work in extraordinary different fields. And it's only when you write books like Joe's that you might think about, well, how I felt, why project. You know, I started talking to Don, our geology professor, when I became interested in tectonic activities across Central Asia. And because I've got one of the world's great experts, conversations aren't about the football match the night before. So when you have this kind of college structure that we have by chance and by fluke, because no one would invent a university like Oxford and Cambridge, there are these amazing benefits of having that interdisciplinary skills. Wouldn't you say, Joe?
Absolutely. Yeah, I would just agree with that.
Thank you very much, both of you. I mean, we decided it all depends on lunch, really. Which is nearly time for here. Thank you very much for coming. We'll all be selling and signing books just next door.
And good luck to
And
Joe.
good luck to Joe.
23 days.
You can't buy it yet, but you can pre-order it, right?
Ladies and gentlemen, a huge round of applause for our speakers, Josephine Quinn, Peter Frankopan, and Mary Baird, for this very, very insightful session. I request them to please accept a scarf. And once again, ladies and gentlemen, the authors will be signing their books to the left-hand kiosk there. You can go there. And some general announcements. The next session we have, which is beginning in exactly 10 minutes.